In the struggling town of Valley View, where hope seemed as scarce as a steady paycheck, master mechanic Roy Edwards found himself on the brink. His last dollar was dwindling, eviction loomed, and his daughter Sarah's college tuition remained a crushing unpaid burden. Just as the local garage, Fletcher's Auto Repair, teetered on the edge of being swallowed by a corporate giant, a gleaming million-dollar Duesenberg rolled into town. Its owner, the wealthy collector Walter Peton, brought with him not just a priceless automobile, but an impossible puzzle, a mysterious engine problem that had baffled 7 of the industry's most renowned mechanics. With his own future hanging by a thread, Roy, a man whose craftsmanship belonged to a forgotten era, took on the challenge. He would work day and night, pouring every ounce of his seasoned expertise into the engineering enigma that had stumped the brightest minds. What unfolded when Peton returned 3 weeks later to find his irreplaceable automobile purring like new, and how the grateful owner transformed Roy's life with an unexpected proposition, became an extraordinary testament to second chances and the remarkable things that happen when true experience finally meets opportunity. Every dawn in Valley View brought with it a fresh wave of dread for Roy. This morning, as the sun barely crested over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across a town that had forgotten how to thrive, Roy Edwards pulled his rusted pickup into the cracked parking lot of Fletcher's Auto Repair. At 58, his body ached with every one of those years, the stiffness particularly acute in the mornings. Arthritis gnawed at his hands, a pain that only truly receded once he was deep in the rhythm of work. That first hour, though, was always a battle. He paused, thermos in hand, his gaze fixed on the garage's faded sign, its paint peeling like an old wound, a mirror of his own fading hopes, of everything in this weary town. He took a slow sip of the coffee Sarah, his daughter, had made before her early class at Valley View Community College. The familiar, crushing weight of worry settled on him as he pictured the unopened tuition bill on his kitchen table. 3 months past due. Just like his mortgage. Just like everything else. Inside, the fluorescent lights sputtered, then grudgingly hummed to life as Roy flicked the switches. The air, thick with the comforting, familiar scent of motor oil, rubber, and warm metal, embraced him like an old, weary friend. For nearly 20 years, this garage had been his sanctuary, his second home, ever since Calvin Fletcher had taken a chance on him after his military service. Now, that sanctuary was crumbling. It might not even last another month. "Morning, Roy," a voice rasped from the back door. Calvin Fletcher shuffled in, each step deliberate, slowed by a hip that had betrayed him years ago. At 62, the constant battle to keep Fletcher's Auto Repair afloat against the relentless tide of auto prime. The gleaming corporate chain that had recently set up shop at the town's edge had etched deep lines into his face, making him look closer to 70 than his actual age. Roy looked up from his methodical preparations. "Morning, Cal. Any word from the bank?" Calvin's silence and the slump of his shoulders spoke volumes before he uttered a single word. "Diane says they can't extend the loan again," he finally managed, his voice hollow. "Patterson from Auto Prime. He called her yesterday. Offered to buy out the mortgage." Roy simply nodded, a tight knot forming in his stomach. He didn't need to speak. Instead, he turned his attention back to his workbench, his hands moving with automatic precision. Each wrench, each socket, each screwdriver had its assigned place, part of a system he had perfected over decades, a small island of order in a world rapidly spinning out of control. Control what you can control, his old mentor Benjamin Tucker used to say. The rest will follow. Roy snapped back to the present. "We've got Miller's Buick coming in at 9, he said, breaking the silence, "and the Wilkinson truck needs a new transmission." He knew it wouldn't be enough. "Won't cover the electric bill, much less the loan payment." Calvin sank heavily onto the stool behind the counter, looking defeated. "I'm sorry, Roy. I know you've got Sarah's tuition to think about." Roy merely shrugged, keeping his face carefully neutral. "We'll make it work. We always do." The phone shrilled, shattering the heavy quiet. Calvin answered, his eyebrows arching higher and higher as he listened. "Yes, Mr. Peton." "Yes, sir. I know who you are." He glanced at Roy, a spark of something unreadable in his eyes. "Actually, I have someone here who might be able to help with that. Yes, sir. We'll be expecting you." Calvin hung up, a strange expression still on his face. "That was Walter Peton," he announced, his voice hushed. The Walter Peton, the car collector. Even Roy had heard of Peton's legendary collection, rumored to be worth tens of millions. "He says he has a 1956 Duesenberg with an engine problem nobody can fix, been to 7 different specialists already." Calvin leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "He's bringing it in this afternoon. For the first and zero, Yarum Sachin de Sakfir. Satin damas de space, time in months." A tiny, fragile flicker of genuine hope ignited in Roy's chest. A job like that could provide a lifeline, keeping them afloat for another month, maybe 2. But he'd been disappointed too many times to dare show it, or to count on anything. Shortly after lunch, a flatbed truck rumbled into the lot. Roy and Calvin stepped outside, watching in hushed awe as the magnificent vehicle was carefully lowered. Even beneath its protective cover, the iconic lines of the Duesenberg were unmistakable. Behind the truck, a sleek black Mercedes pulled in, and from it stepped Walter Peton himself. At 70, Peton carried himself with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His clothes, though simple in cut, were impeccable. A cashmere sweater and tailored slacks that likely cost more than Roy's monthly mortgage payment. Behind him, a woman of similar age emerged from the passenger side, her silver hair elegantly styled, her eyes observing the scene with quiet, discerning interest. "Mr. Fletcher." Peton extended a hand to Calvin, his voice crisp. "Walter Peton, this is my wife Lucille." Calvin shook the offered hand, then gestured towards Roy. "And this is Roy Edwards, the best mechanic in 3 counties. Peton's gaze shifted to Roy, assessing him with the cool, swift calculation of someone who measured people's worth at a glance. Roy met his gaze steadily, his own weathered face an impassive mask. "They tell me you've got a way with engines that can't be taught in schools," Peton stated, a challenge in his tone. Roy wiped his hands on his work rag. "Depends on the engine." A ghost of a smile, almost imperceptible, touched Peton's lips. "Let's see about this one." The cover was removed, revealing a midnight blue 1956 Duesenberg Model J. It was in pristine condition, its chrome gleaming brilliantly in the afternoon sun. Roy approached it slowly, his movements almost reverent. In his 35 years as a mechanic, he had never laid hands on anything quite so rare, so exquisitely valuable. "It's beautiful," he said simply, the words a quiet exhalation. "It was my father's," Peton replied, his voice losing some of its usual stiffness, usual rigid edge. "One, of only 24 ever made with this engine configuration. What seems to be the problem? Roy asked, his voice low. It starts, runs for about 10 minutes, then dies without warning, Peton explained, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. Temperature normal, fuel delivery consistent. It's been to the top restoration experts in the country. No one can figure it out. The last place suggested replacing the entire engine with a reproduction. Peton's mouth tightened with distaste. That would make it worthless, from a collector's standpoint. Roy nodded thoughtfully. Mind if I take a listen first? Be my guest. Peton handed over the keys. Roy slid into the driver's seat, the smooth, cool leather a stark contrast to his work-roughened hands. The interior smelled of aged leather and untold history. He turned the key and the engine purred to life with a deep, powerful hum, a sound that spoke of precision engineering from another era. Roy closed his eyes, just listening. Each engine, Benjamin had taught him, had its own voice, its own particular song. The machine will tell you what's wrong, his mentor used to say. You just have to learn how to listen. After a few minutes, Roy shut off the engine and popped the hood. He began a methodical inspection, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, occasionally pausing to consider what he found. I'd like to keep it for a couple of weeks, he finally said. I need to observe it through several failure cycles to narrow down the problem. Peton frowned. The others all kept it for a month or more. I don't have that kind of time to waste again. 3 weeks, Roy countered, his voice steady. If I can't figure it out by then, I won't charge you a dime for my time. Calvin shot Roy an alarmed look from behind Peton. They couldn't afford to work for free, but he stayed silent. Peton considered Roy for a long moment, his gaze unblinking. And 2 of those experts have PhDs in automotive engineering. One designed engines for Mercedes. What makes you think you can solve something they couldn't? Roy met the man's gaze directly, and quiet resolve in his eyes. Because I have to. Something in Roy's quiet certainty must have registered with Peton. He nodded curtly. 3 weeks. My number is with your boss. He turned to leave, then paused. Mr. Edwards, I'm not a man who enjoys disappointment. After the Petons had gone, Calvin turned to Roy, his voice tinged with worry. You're gambling an awful lot on this one. You got a better idea? Roy was already rolling up his sleeves, his attention already shifting to the sleeping powerhouse before him. Besides, he added, a hint of something almost like excitement in his voice, that engine wants to run. I could hear it. The very next morning, Javier Morales, the shop's youngest mechanic, arrived to find Roy already deep in work. The Duesenberg's engine was partly disassembled, a gleaming work of art exposed. Whoa! Javier stopped short, his eyes wide. Is that what I think it is? Roy grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up from the intricate components he was examining. Boss says you guaranteed a fix. Javier's tone held a mixture of awe and concern. That's a serious museum piece, man. You sure about this? No, Roy admitted truthfully. But we've got nothing to lose at this point. Javier moved closer, peering at the exposed engine components with a fascinated gaze. They don't teach you about these in tech school, he murmured. This thing is like mechanical art. That's the problem with schools today, Roy said, a faint smile playing on his lips. They teach you about computers and diagnostic codes, he lamented, reaching for a specialized tool. But they don't teach you how to feel an engine, how to listen to it. My dad used to say something like that, Javier offered, his voice softer. Before he moved back to Mexico. Roy glanced up, seeing something of himself in the younger man's eager expression. Want to learn something they don't teach in those classes? Javier's face lit up. Hell yes. For the next 2 hours, Roy walked Javier through the intricate systems of the Duesenberg's engine, explaining the engineering principles behind each component, demonstrating how they work together in a delicate mechanical symphony. See this? Roy pointed to a particularly intricate piece, a marvel of forgotten craftsmanship. The way this is designed, there's almost no tolerance for error. Everything has to work in perfect harmony. The bell over the door jangled, announcing a visitor, and Sarah Edwards stepped into the garage. At 21, she possessed her mother's luminous eyes and cascading hair, paired with Roy's own stubborn chin. Her eyes, though, were tired. She'd been working nights at the diner on top of her full-course load. Dad, I brought you lunch. She held up a paper bag, a faint smile on her lips. Figured you'd forget to eat again. Roy straightened, wincing as his back protested. Thanks, sweetheart. You didn't have to do that. Someone's got to look after you. Her gaze shifted to the magnificent Duesenberg, and she whistled softly. So, this is the famous car. Your dad's going to fix what none of those fancy engineers could, Javier piped up, with far more confidence than Roy currently felt. Sarah studied the disassembled engine with a practiced eye. Unlike many fathers, Roy had never seen any reason why his daughter shouldn't learn about engines, and Sarah had inherited his mechanical aptitude. What's the diagnosis so far? She asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. Not sure yet. Something intermittent. Temperature-related maybe, but I'm not convinced. Roy wiped his hands on a rag. How was class? Sarah's expression clouded slightly. Fine, she said, quickly changing the subject. Professor Howard asked about you again. She's still trying to get me to guest lecture in her engineering class. Says her students need to learn from someone with practical experience, not just theory. She hesitated. Then her voice dropped. Dad, I got another notice about the tuition. Roy nodded, avoiding her eyes. I know. I'm handling it. If this job doesn't, she began, her voice laced with worry. It will. Roy cut her off, more sharply than he intended. Seeing her face fall, he softened his tone. It has to, honey. Now don't you worry about it. You focus on your studies. Sarah looked like she wanted to say more, but held back. I've got to get to work. Night shift at Watson's again. You're pushing yourself too hard, Roy said, a familiar ache in his chest. Wonder where I learned that, she replied, with a small, wry smile, kissing him on the cheek before leaving. Roy turned back to the engine, his determination hardening. He had to fix this impossible car, not just for the money, but for Sarah's future, for the silent promise he'd made to Dorothy before she died that their daughter would have the opportunities they never had. Let's get back to work, he said to Javier, his voice firm. This engine isn't going to fix itself. Outside, the sign for Fletcher's Auto Repair creaked mournfully in the relentless wind, a weathered testament to a fading past. Across town, the gleaming new Auto Prime facility shimmered under the afternoon sun, a stark, modern beacon, a constant visual reminder of the formidable stakes at play. But inside the old garage, Roy Edwards, oblivious to the external pressures, focused solely on the intricate mechanical puzzle before him, his weathered hands moving with the confident precision of a craftsman. He knew that sometimes the most complex problems yielded to the simplest solutions, if only you knew how to truly listen. The following day brought a steady drumming rain to Valley View, its relentless patter echoing against the metal roof of Fletcher's auto repair. Roy had arrived before dawn, the first light barely kissing the horizon, driven by an unyielding determination to make progress on the elusive Duesenberg. He had set up a makeshift workstation next to the vintage car, detailed diagrams he'd meticulously borrowed from Martha Sullivan at the town library, spread across a folding table like ancient maps. As he methodically checked the fuel delivery system, his head bowed in concentration, Calvin entered, shaking water from his jacket, his presence a quiet comfort. "You sleep at all last night?" Calvin asked, his gaze falling on the empty coffee cups and the partly disassembled fuel pump on the workbench. Roy shrugged, not breaking his rhythm. "Enough." Calvin studied the diagrams spread out before them. "These look like original manufacturing specs." "They are. Martha found them in some old archives." Roy straightened, wincing as he massaged his lower back. The factory tolerances on these engines were incredibly precise for their time. "I think that might be part of the problem." Just then, the front door opened and Donald Patterson from Auto Prime stepped in, his expensive suit impeccable, despite the downpour outside. At 45, Patterson embodied the polished veneer of corporate success, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his confident smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, his voice smooth and urbane. "Thought I'd stop by to see if you'd reconsidered my offer." Calvin's expression hardened, a familiar weariness in his voice. "Still not interested in selling, Donald?" Patterson's smile remained fixed as he scanned the garage, his gaze then landing on the Duesenberg. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise momentarily disrupting his composure. "Is that a Model J? Must be worth—" "It's a customer's," Roy interrupted, moving subtly to stand between Patterson and the priceless car. "Not for sale." "And who might the customer be?" Patterson pressed, an almost imperceptible glint in his eye. "You know, we don't discuss our clients," Calvin retorted, his voice tight. Patterson nodded, a knowing look crossing his face. "Walter Peton, I'm guessing? Word travels in small towns." He turned his full attention back to Calvin. "I've increased my offer by 15%. The papers are already drawn up." Calvin's face betrayed a flicker of temptation, a subtle shift that made Roy's stomach tighten with dread. "We'll let you know," Calvin said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "Don't wait too long." Patterson handed Calvin a business card, a silent threat embedded in his tone. "The bank's deadline is coming up fast." He nodded curtly at Roy. "Mr. Edwards?" With a final, lingering look at the Duesenberg, Patterson turned and exited into the rain. After Patterson left, a heavy silence settled over the garage, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. 15% is a lot of money, Cal," Roy said quietly, testing the waters. Calvin sighed, pocketing the card, the weight of it palpable. "Would barely cover my debts." He nodded toward the magnificent car. "Besides, we've got a job to finish." Throughout the morning, Roy continued his methodical investigation of the Duesenberg's engine, meticulously documenting each component as he checked it. By noon, He'd systematically eliminated several possible causes, including fuel contamination and various electrical system faults, narrowing the vast field of possibilities. The bell over the door jingled, announcing a new arrival, and Benjamin Tucker shuffled in, leaning heavily on his cane. At 73, Benjamin still possessed the sharp, discerning eyes of the master mechanic he'd once been, eyes that had seen more engines than most men had seen sunrises. "Heard you took on a real challenge," Benjamin said by way of greeting, his voice raspy but warm. Roy smiled for the first time that day, a genuine, unburdened smile. "News travels fast." "Small town," Benjamin replied, a knowing twinkle in his eye as he approached the Duesenberg. He whistled appreciatively, his head tilting as he took in the vintage beauty. "Haven't seen one of these in 30 years. "Could use your eyes on this, Ben," Roy admitted, stepping aside. Together they examined the engine, speaking in the familiar shorthand of men who had worked side by side for years. Benjamin had taught Roy much of what he knew, taking him under his wing when Roy had returned from military service, directionless and struggling to readjust to civilian life. Intermittent failure after running for a while, Benjamin mused, his gnarled fingers tracing a line along a pipe. "Could be vapor lock." "That's what I thought initially, but the fuel system checks out," Roy countered, pointing to his detailed notes. "Compression's good. Ignition timing perfect." Benjamin ran his fingers lightly over the cylinder head, a thoughtful frown on his face. "What about thermal expansion? These old engines had such tight tolerances. If something's expanding differently than designed—" Roy considered this, a flicker of renewed interest in his eyes. It was a lead worth looking into. "I'd need to run it until failure and measure critical clearances at operating temperature." "Might need specialized equipment for that," Benjamin pointed out, a slight grimace on his face. "Which we don't have," Roy acknowledged, frustration subtly edging his voice. Benjamin patted him on the shoulder, a comforting, familiar gesture. "You'll figure it out, son. You always do." After Benjamin left, Roy continued working, the old man's words echoing in his mind, a gentle nudge of encouragement. As the afternoon wore on, he prepared to test run the engine again, hoping this time to observe the precise failure sequence firsthand. The garage door opened again, and Sarah entered carrying a paper bag from Watson's Diner. "Brought you dinner?" she said, her voice a little tired but cheerful. "Charles says it's on the house. He's heard about your project." Roy accepted the bag gratefully. "Seems everyone has." Sarah examined his meticulous notes, her gaze sharp and intelligent. "You think it's a thermal issue?" "Maybe," Roy replied, "but I need to observe it through a complete cycle." Sarah glanced at her watch. "I've got 2 hours before my evening class. Want some help?" Roy smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "Absolutely." Together they prepared the engine for a test run. Sarah's smaller hands and agile movements allowed her to reach places Roy couldn't. As they worked side by side, Roy was struck by how capable his daughter had become, how much she resembled her late mother in her quiet determination. "You know," Sarah said as she adjusted a gauge with practiced ease, "Professor Howard says I have a natural talent for mechanical engineering. Says I get it from you." "Francis always did give me too much credit," Roy replied modestly, a hint of pride in his voice. "She says you could have been an engineer if you'd had the opportunity." Sarah's voice carried a hint of their old, unspoken argument. "Like you're making sure I do." Roy focused on connecting a wire, his hands steadied despite the surge of emotion. Different times, different choices. Mom would be proud of you, Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper, of how you've taken care of me since she's been gone. Roy felt the familiar, sharp ache at the mention of Dorothy. 5 years since cancer had cruelly taken her, and sometimes the loss still felt as fresh and raw as the day it happened. The medical bills had wiped out their savings, starting the slow, agonizing financial slide that had led to their current predicament. "She'd be proud of you," he corrected gently, then clapped his hands together, forcing a lighter tone. "Now let's fire this thing up." They started the engine, which roared to life with a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. Roy connected a pressure gauge to monitor fuel delivery, while Sarah, with a focused intensity, recorded temperature readings at regular intervals. After exactly 11 minutes, the engine suddenly sputtered and died, just as Peton had described. "Did you see that?" Roy asked, a surge of excitement in his voice despite the failure. "Right before it quit?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. Pressure dropped, then spiked, then nothing. Roy was already reaching for the cylinder head, carefully checking its temperature with his hand. "It's not vapor lock, and the electrical system is still functioning." He paused, deep in thought. "We need to monitor internal clearances during operation." "How?" Sarah asked, gesturing helplessly. "We don't have that kind of equipment." Roy's eyes lit up with an idea, a spark of inspiration. "But Dr. Howard might." The next morning found Roy at Valley View Community College, waiting patiently outside Dr. Francis Howard's office. At 55, Francis Howard was one of the few people in town who possessed both academic credentials and a profound practical respect for hands-on expertise. "Roy Edwards," she said warmly, her smile genuine as she approached, a stack of papers in her arms. "Sarah said, you might be stopping by." "Need your help, Francis," Roy explained, getting straight to the point. "I'm working on a Duesenberg with an intermittent failure problem. Need to measure thermal expansion of engine components during operation." Francis raised an eyebrow, a flicker of professional curiosity in her eyes. "That's quite specific. Let me guess. Walter Peton's car." "News really does travel fast around here," Roy chuckled. "Small town," she said with a shrug and a smile. "Come on. I think we have what you need in the engineering lab." The lab was empty, classes not yet in session. Francis led Roy to a storage cabinet and unlocked it, revealing an array of specialized diagnostic equipment. "We just got a grant for new thermal imaging systems," she explained, gesturing to the sophisticated cameras. "And we have precision micrometers that might help." "This is exactly what I need," Roy said, examining the equipment with the reverence of a scholar. "Could I borrow it for a day or two?" "Better than that," Francis replied, her eyes twinkling. "I'll help you use it. Been a while since I got my hands dirty with a real-world problem. The students can manage without me for a day." Back at the garage, Francis helped Roy set up the borrowed equipment. Together, they prepared the engine for another test run, this time with the thermal imaging cameras recording temperature variations across critical components in real time. "You know," Francis said as they worked in comfortable silence, "I've been trying to get you to guest lecture in my advanced engineering class for years." "I'm not much for classrooms," Roy replied, adjusting a sensor with practiced ease. "That's exactly why I want you there. These students need to understand that engineering isn't just formulas and computer models. It's about intuition and experience, too. Before Roy could respond, the door opened and Javier entered, followed by two older men Roy didn't recognize. "Sorry to interrupt," Javier said, a hint of awkwardness in his voice. "These gentlemen were asking about the Duesenberg." One of the men stepped forward, extending his hand. "Jack Wilson, Classic Auto Magazine. We heard Walter Peton's famous Model J was here. Wondered if we might get a few photographs for an article we're working on." Roy shook his head. "Not without the owner's permission." "Just a few shots," the man persisted, his voice laced with practiced charm. "This car is legendary in collector circles." "I said no." Roy's tone left no room for argument. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got work to do." After they reluctantly departed, Francis gave Roy an appraising look. "You just turned down free publicity." "It's not my car to show off," Roy said simply. "Besides, I haven't fixed it yet." They completed the setup and started the engine once more. Francis monitored the thermal imaging display while Roy observed the engine's performance, his ears tuned to its every nuance. As they approached the 10-minute mark, Roy noticed a subtle change in the engine sound, a slight variation in timing that most ears would certainly miss. "Something's happening," he murmured. Francis pointed to the display. "Look at this. The rear cylinder block is heating differently than the others. And this part here," she indicated a specific area with a practiced finger, "the expansion rate is inconsistent." Roy watched intently as the anomaly developed, a cold certainty growing within him. When the engine failed at precisely 12 minutes, he immediately focused on the area Francis had identified. "That's it," he breathed, a breakthrough in his voice. "The thermal expansion is causing a misalignment in the rear block. But why?" They spent the next several hours analyzing the data, Roy's practical knowledge complementing Francis's theoretical understanding. A powerful synergy. By late afternoon, they had narrowed the problem to a specific area, but still couldn't identify the root cause. "We're missing something," Roy said, frustration evident in his voice, close to the edge of exasperation. Just then, the garage door opened and Calvin entered, his face grim, accompanied by Sheriff Richard Barnes. "Roy," Calvin said, his voice unusually strained, "Richard says there's been a break-in at your place." Roy felt a cold jolt of alarm, his heart instantly leaping to his daughter. "Sarah?" "She's fine," Richard assured him quickly, seeing the panic in his eyes. "She's the one who called it in, came home from class, and found the door forced open." "What was taken?" Roy asked, already reaching for his jacket, his mind racing. "That's just it," Richard replied, a puzzled frown on his face. "Nothing valuable, just some papers from your desk. Sarah said they were old repair manuals and notes." Roy and Francis exchanged a quick, knowing glance. "I need to go check on her," Roy said, already moving towards the door. "Go." Francis nodded, her expression serious. "I'll secure the equipment and lock up here." When Roy arrived home, Sarah was sitting on the porch steps of their modest single-story house, looking small and shaken. She stood as he pulled up, rushing to meet him. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, before he could even ask, her voice a little shaky. "Just rattled." Inside, the house showed signs of a hasty, almost surgical search. Drawers in Roy's home office were pulled open, their contents scattered. Papers, were scattered across the floor, and drawers in Roy's home office were pulled open, their contents strewn about. As Sarah had reported, nothing of obvious value was missing. Not the TV, not Dorothy's cherished jewelry, not even the emergency cash Roy kept hidden in a kitchen canister. "Just my old repair journals and some technical notes," Roy confirmed, a puzzled frown on his face after checking his desk. "Why would anyone want those?" Sheriff Barnes examined the broken lock on the back door, his expression professional but unrevealing. Could be a random junkie looking for something to sell. But Roy wasn't convinced. The timing was too coincidental, right when he was making crucial progress on the Duesenberg. "I don't like you staying here alone tonight," he told Sarah, his voice firm. "Go pack a bag. You can stay with Esther." Sarah started to protest, then saw the deep worry etched in her father's eyes and nodded. "Just for tonight." After Sarah had gone to her grandmother's and the sheriff had left, the house felt unnervingly silent. Roy returned to the garage. The Duesenberg sat silently in the bay, its elegant lines highlighted by the single overhead light Roy had left on, a silent testament to the impossible task before him. He approached the engine, considering what they had discovered that day. The thermal imaging had revealed the anomaly, the precise symptoms, but not the root cause. He needed to think differently to see what 7 experts with advanced degrees and state-of-the-art equipment had missed. Roy pulled up a stool and simply sat, looking at the engine. Benjamin had taught him this technique. Sometimes you had to stop analyzing and just observe. Let the machine speak to you. As the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, Roy's mind quieted, his focus narrowing solely to the intricate machinery before him. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured aloud. Suddenly a memory surfaced, vivid and clear. Benjamin working on an old tractor engine when Roy was first learning the trade, a young, eager apprentice. "Sometimes the problem isn't what's there," Benjamin had said, his voice slow and deliberate. "It's what isn't there." Roy straightened, a new, audacious possibility forming in his mind. What if the issue wasn't a faulty part, but a missing one? Or, even more subtly, a modification that shouldn't have been made, a non-standard component inserted where an original belonged. He reached for the original specifications again, the meticulously copied diagrams from Martha's archives, comparing them to the engine before him with a renewed intensity. For hours he worked, checking and rechecking measurements, part numbers, and configurations, his eyes scanning every detail, his mind making connections. As dawn broke over Valley View, painting the sky with hues of rose and gold, Roy finally sat back, a mixture of disbelief and profound satisfaction on his face. He'd found a discrepancy so subtle that it would have been easily overlooked, a non-standard component that had been installed during a previous restoration, likely decades ago. It functioned perfectly under normal conditions. But as the engine reached operating temperature, the slightly different expansion rate caused a minute misalignment that eventually starved the engine of oxygen, causing it to die. The solution, once identified, was elegant in its simplicity. They needed to replace the non-original component with one that matched the correct specifications exactly. The true challenge now would be finding or fabricating such a rare, precise part. Roy reached for the phone, checking his watch. It was early, but this couldn't wait. He dialed a number from memory. "Hello?" came Benjamin's gruff, sleep-roughened voice from the other end. "Ben, it's Roy. I found the problem, but I need your help with something." Outside, The first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the old garage, casting a hopeful glow. The first light of day illuminated the weathered, peeling sign of Fletcher's Auto Repair, a stark contrast to the gleaming, futuristic facade of the Auto Prime facility across town. But within those worn walls, amidst the familiar scents of oil and metal, Roy Edwards had just accomplished what the brightest minds in automotive engineering, armed with their PhDs and cutting-edge technology, could not. He had simply listened to what an engine from another era was trying to tell him, and he had understood. The morning light streamed through the high windows of Benjamin Tucker's workshop, illuminating decades of collected tools and mechanical treasures, each bearing the silent testament of countless repairs. Located behind his modest home on the outskirts of Valley View, the workshop was Benjamin's sanctuary, a place where the retired mechanic could still practice the craft that had defined his life. Roy stood beside his old mentor, both men examining the detailed drawings Roy had made of the problematic engine component, a blueprint of his breakthrough. "It's a modified oil transfer sleeve," Roy explained, tracing a line on the paper. "Someone replaced the original with this at some point. It's 1/1000th of an inch different in wall thickness, practically invisible to the naked eye. But when the engine heats up, the expansion rate differs just enough to cause binding." "No wonder those fancy experts missed it," Benjamin finished, nodding slowly, a knowing glint in his eye. "They were looking for something broken, not something that was almost right." "Exactly." Roy spread out the original specifications. "The problem is, their part hasn't been manufactured since 1962. We need to either find an original or make one ourselves." Benjamin's weathered face creased in thought, his gaze distant as he sifted through decades of contacts and memories. "I might know someone who could help. Old colleague who specialized in vintage restorations. Retired now, but he kept an inventory of rare parts. Let me make a call." While Benjamin went to his vintage rotary phone, Roy examined the various projects scattered around the workshop. Unlike the sterile, computerized facilities of modern repair shops, Benjamin's space was a testament to hands-on craftsmanship, lathes, mills, and hand tools that had shaped metal with precision long before computers guided the process. It was a place where true mechanical artistry thrived. "Franklin says he might have something similar," Benjamin reported, returning from his call, "but it would need modification, and he's 3 hours away in Carson City." Roy checked his watch, his mind already calculating the logistics. "If I leave now, I could be back by evening." "Take my truck," Benjamin offered, tossing him the keys. "Better than that rust bucket of yours for a long drive." After a quick call to Calvin to explain his absence, Roy set out for Carson City. The long drive gave him time to think, to process the whirlwind of events from the past few days. The break-in at his house still troubled him deeply. If someone was specifically after his technical notes and old repair journals, it suggested something far more sinister than just random theft. It hinted at a targeted effort, perhaps to hinder his progress or steal his knowledge. Franklin Hughes's place turned out to be a converted barn, filled with more automotive history than most museums. At 78, Franklin had the energetic manner of a man half his age, his eyes sparkling with an almost childlike enthusiasm as he eagerly led Roy through his incredible collection of parts and vintage machinery. "Ben said you're working on a Duesenberg Model J," Franklin said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Don't get many of those around anymore." "It belongs to Walter Peton," Roy explained, watching the older man's face for a reaction. Franklin whistled, a low, impressed sound. I've heard of his collection. Very particular man, from what they say. That's putting it mildly, Roy agreed with a wry smile. After searching through meticulously organized drawers and cabinets that seemed to hold the automotive history of the last century, Franklin produced several oil transfer sleeves of varying vintages. This one's from a '58 model, he explained, handing Roy a small cylindrical component, its metal gleaming faintly. Closest I've got to what you need. The dimensions are off by about 0.02, but with Ben's lathe, you could modify it. Roy examined the part, his fingers tracing its contours. This is good work. What do I owe you? Franklin waved him off, a genuine smile on his face. Consider it professional courtesy. Just tell Ben he still owes me for that carburetor from '82. By the time Roy returned to Valley View, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. He drove straight to Benjamin's workshop, eager to begin the modifications. To his surprise, he found not only Benjamin waiting, but also Sarah and Javier. Thought you could use some help, Sarah explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Javier picked me up after his shift. And I brought food, Javier added, pointing proudly to a stack of pizza boxes on Benjamin's workbench. For the next several hours, the four of them worked together on modifying the sleeve. Benjamin's expertise with the precision lathe was crucial. His hands were steady, despite his age, as he meticulously shaved off microscopic amounts of metal, guided by the precise measurements Roy provided. Sarah assisted, her engineering studies giving her a solid theoretical understanding of the exact tolerances they needed to achieve, a perfect blend of theory and practice. Javier watched, absorbing everything with a hungry curiosity. They don't teach this stuff in tech school, he commented, his voice filled with awe. It's all computerized diagnostics now. Nothing wrong with new techniques, Benjamin replied, his eyes fixed on the micrometer he was using to measure his progress, his voice calm and wise. But they're tools, not replacements for understanding the fundamentals. That's what Professor Howard always says, Sarah agreed, smiling at her father's old mentor. She believes the best engineers need both theoretical knowledge and practical experience. By midnight, they had successfully modified the part to match the original specifications exactly. Roy held it up to the light, a small, unassuming cylinder that had just cost them 12 hours of collective focused work. Hard to believe something so small could cause so much trouble, Javier remarked, shaking his head. That's engineering for you, Benjamin said, a knowing glint in his eye. The devil's in the details. The next morning, Roy arrived at Fletcher's auto repair earlier than usual, the perfectly modified sleeve securely in his pocket. Calvin was already there, watching as a tow truck delivered a dented station wagon with front-end damage. Fender, bender, on Main Street, Calvin explained, grimacing. Insurance job. Should help with this month's bills. Roy nodded, his mind already turning to the Duesenberg. I found the problem and the solution. He spent the next 2 hours carefully reinstalling the modified sleeve along with the other components he'd removed during diagnosis. Every step was methodical, precise, executed with the focused intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. When he finally closed the hood, the chrome gleaming, Calvin approached, his eyes full of anticipation. Ready for a test run? Let's find out. Roy slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine started with a powerful, deep purr that filled the garage. Immediately, its powerful purr filling the garage with a deep, reassuring thrum. Both men watched the clock, their eyes glued to the seconds ticking by. 10 minutes passed. Then 11. Then 12. The precise point where the engine had previously failed, every single time. The engine continued running smoothly, a harmonious symphony of precision. "Let it run for a full hour," Roy insisted, his voice low but firm. "I want to be absolutely certain." While they waited, a new, unwelcome presence entered the garage. The front door opened, and Donald Patterson strode in, this time accompanied by Mayor William Harris. "Calvin! Roy!" The mayor greeted them with the forced joviality of a politician, a smile plastered on his face. "Hope we're not interrupting." "What can we do for you, Bill?" Calvin asked, weariness in his tone, a premonition of trouble. Patterson stepped forward, his corporate smile unwavering. "We've come with a proposition. The town council met last night to discuss the development plan for this area. Auto Prime is prepared to make a significant investment in Valley View. New facilities, jobs, tax revenue. And let me guess," Roy interjected, his voice flat. "You need this property to make it happen." The mayor had the grace to look uncomfortable, shuffling his feet. "The plan would revitalize Main Street, bring in new businesses." He trailed off, then continued, his voice losing some of its forced cheer. "The council is considering using eminent domain if necessary, but we'd prefer a voluntary sale." Calvin's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "So, you're threatening to take my business if I don't sell?" "It's not a threat," Patterson said smoothly, his eyes devoid of emotion. "It's progress. The reality is operations like this," he gestured around the cluttered, time-worn garage with a dismissive wave, "are becoming obsolete. Modern vehicles need modern facilities, computerized diagnostics. The future is Auto Prime." Roy noticed the mayor's eyes drifting to the Duesenberg, still running flawlessly beyond its previous failure point, a beacon of defiance in the old garage. "Is that Peton's car?" the mayor asked, a flicker of genuine interest in his voice. "I heard you were working on it." "News travels fast," Roy remarked dryly, a subtle warning in his tone. "Small town," Patterson replied with a thin, knowing smile. "I understand several experts have failed to fix that engine. Ambitious of you to try where they failed." Something in Patterson's tone, a veiled smugness, made Roy uneasy. Before he could respond, the front door opened again, and Walter Peton himself entered, accompanied by his wife, Lucille. The room suddenly felt crowded, a tension thick with conflicting agendas and unspoken resentments. "Mr. Edwards?" Peton acknowledged Roy with a concise nod, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on progress." His eyes narrowed at the sight of the mayor and Patterson, his voice turning icy. "I wasn't aware this was a public viewing." An awkward silence fell, broken only by the steady, powerful purr of the Duesenberg's engine, now running for over 30 minutes without a single issue. The mayor recovered first, extending his hand with a politician's practiced ease. "Mr. Peton, an honor to meet you. I'm Mayor Harris." Peton shook the offered hand briefly, his grip firm but perfunctory. "Yes, I know who you are. Your council denied my request to establish a vintage automobile museum here 3 years ago, said it wouldn't generate enough revenue for the town." The mayor's smile faltered, a flush rising on his cheeks. Circumstances change. In fact, we're currently discussing new development opportunities. I'm sure you are, Peton replied dryly, his attention already returning to Roy and the humming masterpiece beside him. The engine is running. Yes, sir, Roy confirmed, a quiet pride in his voice. It has been for over 30 minutes now. I believe we've identified and fixed the problem. Disbelief flickered across Peton's face, quickly replaced by a guarded optimism. Explain. Roy concisely described the non-standard component, detailing how its subtle difference in thermal properties caused the intermittent failure once the engine reached operating temperature. As he spoke, he could see Patterson and the mayor exchanging quick, uneasy glances. "And you're confident this is permanently resolved?" Peton asked, his voice precise and demanding when Roy had finished. "Yes, sir. The engine should now function as originally designed." Peton moved closer to the car, listening to the engine with the focused appreciation of a true enthusiast, his eyes reflecting a profound understanding of its intricate beauty. "Remarkable." He turned to Roy. "I'd like to take it for a test drive." "Of course." Roy handed him the keys. "It's ready when you are." Peton turned to his wife. "Lucille, would you like to join me?" "I wouldn't miss it," she replied with a warm smile that transformed her elegant features, a quiet joy in her eyes. As the Petons prepared to take the car out, the mayor cleared his throat, seizing the moment. "Mr. Peton, while you're here, I'd love to discuss your museum idea again. The council has reconsidered its position." Peton raised an eyebrow, a hint of disdain in his gaze. "Has it now?" "Interesting timing." He glanced pointedly at Patterson, then back to the mayor. "Perhaps another time. Right now, I'm more interested in seeing if Mr. Edwards has accomplished what 6 specialists with advanced degrees could not." With that, he slid into the driver's seat, and with a final, magnificent roar, the Duesenberg purred out of the garage and onto the street. After the Petons had driven off, Patterson turned to Calvin, his smile gone. "My offer stands for 48 more hours. After that, I can't guarantee the terms will remain as favorable." When they'd gone, Calvin slumped onto his stool, defeated. "They're going to take the garage, Roy, one way or another." "Maybe," Roy conceded, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Or maybe Peton's car running again changes things." "How?" Calvin countered, gesturing around the aging garage. "It's one job, not a business model." Roy had no immediate answer for that. The truth was, even with the Peton job, Fletcher's auto repair was still in dire financial straits. The bank loan was coming due, and modern vehicles increasingly required expensive equipment they simply couldn't afford. The afternoon passed, with Roy and Calvin working on the station wagon. The routine, unglamorous work, a stark contrast to the precision engineering of the Duesenberg. Neither mentioned Patterson's ultimatum, but it hung heavy in the air between them, a silent countdown. At precisely 4 p.m., the distinctive, powerful rumble of the Duesenberg announced the Petons' return. Walter parked the classic car in front of the garage and stepped out, his expression unreadable, betraying no hint of his thoughts. 2 hours of continuous operation, he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "No issues whatsoever." Roy allowed himself a small, private smile, a sense of quiet triumph. "I'm glad to hear it, sir." "How much do I owe you?" Peton asked, his gaze fixed on Roy. Calvin started to speak, but Roy cut him off, a subtle shake of his head. The original agreement was 3 weeks. We delivered in less than 1. Standard labor rates plus the cost of parts. Peton's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise. Most would charge a premium for such specialized work. We are not most people, Roy replied simply, his gaze steady, meeting Peton's direct look. Peton studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, a subtle approval in his eyes. No, you're not. He turned to his wife. Lucille, would you mind driving the Mercedes back? I'd like to speak with Mr. Edwards privately. After Lucille had departed, the Mercedes pulling away, Peton gestured to the Duesenberg, its midnight blue paint shimmering. Take a drive, Mr. Edwards. With me, Mr. Edwards, there's something I'd like to discuss. As they pulled away from the garage, the Duesenberg's engine a deep, resonant purr. Roy couldn't help but appreciate the smooth power of the machine he'd just repaired, the way it responded to Peton's confident, practiced handling. They drove in silence for several minutes, heading out of town toward the rolling countryside that surrounded Valley View, leaving the concerns of the garage behind. I've spent my life collecting things of quality, Mr. Edwards, Peton said finally, his voice calm, reflective. Things built with precision and care, like this automobile. In my experience, such quality has become increasingly rare. Roy waited, sensing there was more coming, a prelude to a deeper conversation. The experts who failed to repair this car had impressive credentials, Peton continued. Degrees from prestigious universities, state-of-the-art facilities, yet none of them could do what you did with basic tools and experience. They were looking in the wrong places, Roy said modestly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Perhaps they lacked something that can't be taught in schools. Peton glanced at him, his eyes sharp. I understand your garage is in financial trouble. That auto prime is pressuring Mr. Fletcher to sell. Roy's surprise must have shown on his face. As I said, small town, Peton explained, with a slight knowing smile. I make it my business to know what's happening around me. They crested a hill and Peton pulled over at a scenic overlook. In the distance, Valley View spread out beneath them, its mix of historic buildings and newer development visible even from this distance, a patchwork of old and new. I also know about your daughter, Peton continued, his voice softer. Bright girl, engineering student following in her father's footsteps, but with the formal education you never had. Roy tensed, a familiar defensiveness rising within him. Sarah's education is my concern, Mr. Peton. Of course. Peton turned in his seat to face Roy directly, his expression serious. I'm not prying, Mr. Edwards. I'm proposing an opportunity, one that could secure both your future and your daughter's. Roy listened, a weary skepticism mixing with a nascent flicker of hope as Peton outlined his proposition. The wealthy collector wanted to establish a vintage automobile restoration facility, not just a museum, but a working shop, a living testament dedicated to maintaining and meticulously restoring classic vehicles like the Duesenberg, ensuring their continued existence for generations to come. I need someone with your skills to run it, Peton concluded, his gaze firm and direct. Someone who understands these machines in a way modern technicians don't. I'm prepared to finance the entire operation, with you as head mechanic and partial owner. Roy stared at him, momentarily speechless, the implications slowly dawning. That's a generous offer? It's a business decision, Peton corrected, a faint smile touching his lips. Quality recognizes quality, Mr. Edwards. I've spent a lifetime finding and preserving exceptional things. Your skill is exceptional. As the full implications sank in, Roy's thoughts raced, a whirlwind of possibilities. Such an opportunity would solve his financial problems immediately, comprehensively. Sarah's tuition would be covered, entirely. No more worrying about mortgage payments, about the looming threat of eviction. "What about Calvin?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse. "And Fletcher's auto repair?" "That would be between you and Mr. Fletcher," Peton replied, a subtle hint in his tone. "Though I imagine a new venture might have room for an experienced business manager." The sun was beginning to set as they sat on the hill, casting long shadows across the valley. They drove back toward town, painting Valley View in a warm golden light. Roy remained quiet, his mind a whirlwind, processing the monumental offer Peton had just extended. "You don't need to decide immediately," Peton said as they pulled up in front of the garage, breaking the silence. "Take a few days to consider." Roy nodded, stepping out of the car, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the heat of the day's events. "Thank you, Mr. Peton, for the opportunity." "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," Peton replied, his gaze direct and sincere, "for reminding me that true expertise can't always be measured by degrees or certifications." As the Duesenberg pulled away, its powerful engine a receding hum, Roy stood in the fading light, watching it disappear down Main Street. The future, which had seemed so bleak just days ago, suddenly held possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. Yet, with those possibilities came difficult choices. Loyalty to Calvin versus a chance for true financial security. Staying with the comfortable, familiar routine versus risking something entirely new and uncertain. Inside the garage, the phone was ringing, its insistent sound pulling Roy back to the present. He hurried to answer it, still distracted by Peton's extraordinary proposition. "Fletcher's auto repair," he answered automatically, his mind still half elsewhere. "Dad!" Sarah's voice was tight, with alarm, cutting through his reverie. "You need to come home right now. There's been another break-in, and this time they left something behind." Roy's truck skidded to a halt in the gravel driveway of his modest single-story home. Sheriff Barnes's patrol car was already parked out front, its lights flashing silently in the growing dusk, casting eerie, shifting shadows. Sarah stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face pale. "What happened?" Roy asked, his voice strained with worry as he approached, taking in her shaken posture. "I came home to get some books for study group," Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The door was open again, but this time they left something on your workbench." Inside, Sheriff Barnes was examining a manila envelope placed conspicuously in the center of Roy's workbench. He looked up as Roy entered, his expression grim. "Didn't touch it," Barnes said, indicating the envelope with a nod. "Figured you should see it first." Roy approached cautiously. His name was written on the envelope in stark block letters. There was no return address, no postmark. "Open it," Sarah urged, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. With careful, deliberate fingers, Roy unsealed the envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of technical specifications for a Duesenberg Model J, specifically focusing on the oil transfer system, the very system he had just repaired. A small yellow post-it note was attached to one corner with a brief, chilling message. "Stop work on the car, or next time, it won't be empty." Roy handed the paper to Sheriff Barnes, who examined it with a deep frown. "This connected to that fancy car you're fixing?" "Has to be," Roy confirmed, his jaw tightening. "But I've already fixed it. Walter Peton picked it up this afternoon." Barnes's frown deepened further. "Somebody doesn't know that, or doesn't want you getting credit for it." He slipped the paper carefully into an evidence bag. "I'll dust for prints, but don't get your hopes up. Looks professional." After the sheriff left, promising to increase patrols in the area, Roy and Sarah sat at their kitchen table, the silence of the house amplified by their unease. The house felt violated, their sense of security shaken to its core. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice small. "Why would anyone care if you fixed Peton's car?" Roy shook his head slowly, his mind racing, trying to connect the disparate pieces. "I don't know, but I'm not comfortable with you staying here alone tonight." "I'm not leaving you alone," Sarah protested, her voice firm. "And I'm not arguing about this," Roy replied, equally resolute. "You'll stay with Esther for a few more days, just until we figure this out." While Sarah packed an overnight bag, Roy called Calvin to update him on the alarming situation. "Something's not right," he concluded, his voice low with concern. "First they steal my notes, now this warning, after the job's already done." "Maybe it's connected to Patterson," Calvin suggested, a grim note in his voice. "The timing seems suspicious." "Maybe. Listen, Cal, I need to tell you something else." Roy then explained Peton's proposition for the restoration facility, outlining the extraordinary opportunity. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You should take it, Roy," Calvin said finally, his voice devoid of bitterness, only a quiet resignation. "It's a great opportunity. I'm not leaving you in the lurch, Cal, not with everything that's happening." "Don't be an idiot, Roy," Calvin said, his gruff voice softening, a hint of affection in his tone. "Fletcher's is dying. We both know it. I've been thinking about retirement anyway." "Just don't make any decisions about the garage yet," Roy urged. "Let me talk to Peton again. See if there's a way to make this work for both of us." After dropping Sarah at her grandmother's house, a small measure of comfort knowing she was safe, Roy drove to Watson's diner. Despite the late hour, the lights were still on, a warm glow spilling onto the wet street. Charles Watson's establishment was a Valley View institution, serving as the unofficial community gathering place for decades, where secrets were shared over bottomless coffee. The bell jingled as Roy entered. Only a few customers remained, nursing coffee in worn vinyl booths, their faces illuminated by the dim, familiar glow of the fluorescent lights. Charles looked up from behind the counter and nodded in greeting. "Heard you fixed that impossible car," he said as Roy slid onto a stool, the worn vinyl sighing under his weight. "News travels fast in a small town," Roy finished with a tired smile, a faint echo of the day's stress in his voice. "I know." Doris. Miller, the night waitress, a woman who seemed to know everyone's order before they spoke, poured him coffee without asking. "You look like you could use something stronger than this," she observed, her gaze sympathetic. "Coffee is fine. Thanks." Roy wrapped his hands around the warm mug, letting its heat seep into his tired muscles. "Charles, you hear things. Has anyone been asking about me or the Duesenberg?" Charles considered this while slowly wiping down the counter, his movements deliberate. "Come to think of it, there was a fellow in here yesterday. Well-dressed, not local. Asked if it was true you were working on Peton's car." "What did you tell him?" Roy asked, his gaze fixed on Charles. Charles shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference. "What everyone knows. That you're the best mechanic within 100 miles, and if anyone could fix it, you could." "Did he say who he was?" "Nope." "Paid cash. Didn't leave a name." Roy sipped his coffee thoughtfully, the pieces of a new puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "Any idea where he was staying?" "Checked in at the Valley View Inn, I believe," Doris interjected. From behind the counter, her voice surprisingly clear. "My cousin works the front desk there." An hour later, Roy was parked across the street from the Valley View Inn, a modest two-story motel on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering erratically. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing there or what he hoped to accomplish, but instinct, that old, reliable companion, told him the mysterious visitor and the break-ins were connected. His cell phone rang, startling him, its sudden vibration in the quiet car making him jump. The display showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello, Mr. Edwards. Walter Peton here." The collector's voice was unmistakable, sharp, and clear. "I wanted to inform you that the Duesenberg performed flawlessly throughout the entire drive home." "Flawlessly on the drive home. Your reputation is well-deserved." "Thank you, sir. That's good to hear." Roy hesitated, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "Have you given any thought to my proposition?" "I have, but there have been some complications," Roy admitted, his gaze sweeping the darkened motel parking lot. "Someone broke into my house again? Left a threatening note about working on your car?" There was a long pause on Peton's end, a silence that stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. "I see. That is concerning. Did you contact the authorities?" "Sheriff Barnes is investigating, but there's not much to go on." "Perhaps we should discuss this further in person," Peton suggested, his voice now crisp and decisive. "Would tomorrow morning be convenient? Say 9 at my home." After getting directions to the sprawling Peton estate, Roy ended the call. His suspicions were now fully aroused. The timing of the call, coming just as he was investigating the mysterious visitor at the inn, seemed far too coincidental. As he watched the motel, a sleek black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Two men in business suits emerged, their movements efficient, alert, professional, and entered the lobby. Something about their manner, their almost military bearing, triggered Roy's instincts. These weren't tourists or traveling salesmen. Roy slumped lower in his seat, suddenly feeling exposed, as if he had inadvertently stumbled into a dangerous game. What had he stumbled into? This was supposed to be a simple repair job, not something that attracted threatening notes and mysterious, watchful visitors. After watching for another 30 minutes without seeing the men again, Roy drove home, his mind churning with a relentless stream of questions. He double-checked all the locks before trying to sleep, but rest proved elusive, his thoughts circling the unsettling events. Morning came too soon. Roy showered and dressed with care, selecting his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-down shirt he usually reserved for church. Today's meeting with Peton felt important, pivotal even, a crossroads in his life. The Peton estate lay 15 miles outside Valley View, at the end of a long private drive bordered by ancient oak trees that formed a leafy, winding tunnel. The house itself was impressive without being ostentatious. A sprawling ranch-style home constructed of natural stone and timber, nestled elegantly against the backdrop of rolling hills. As Roy pulled up, he noticed several outbuildings behind the main house, including a large structure that could only be a private garage or workshop, far more extensive than anything he had imagined. Walter Peton was waiting on the front porch, dressed casually in khakis and a polo shirt, a stark contrast to his usual formal attire. "Mr. Edwards, welcome," he greeted, shaking Roy's hand with a firm, professional grip. "Please come in." The interior of the home was warm and inviting, its decor reflecting a genuine appreciation for craftsmanship and history rather than showy wealth. Lucille Peton emerged from what appeared to be a study, greeting Roy with a warmth her husband's more reserved manner often lacked. "The man who fixed the unfixable," she said with a genuine smile that transformed her elegant features. "Walter hasn't stopped talking about it." "It wasn't unfixable," Roy replied modestly, a slight flush rising to his cheeks. "Just misdiagnosed. Precisely why I want to discuss this business proposition further," Peton said, gesturing toward the study. "Shall we?" The study was lined with bookshelves containing countless volumes on automotive history and engineering, a testament to Peton's deep passion. One wall displayed framed photographs of vintage automobiles, many featuring Peton standing proudly beside them, each a gleaming piece of history. "Coffee?" Peton offered, gesturing to a tray. "Thank you." Once they were seated with steaming cups, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. Peton leaned forward, his expression serious, his eyes fixed on Roy. "Now tell me more about this threatening note." Roy explained the 2 break-ins at his house and the chilling warning to stop work on the car, the story unfolding with a disturbing clarity. Peton listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail, concern etched onto his face. "You have no idea who might be behind this?" he asked when Roy had finished, his voice grave. "None, though there was a stranger asking questions at Watson's Diner, and I saw some men at the Valley View Inn last night who seemed out of place. Professional, almost military." Peton set down his cup with deliberate care, a faint clink of porcelain. "I should probably tell you something, Mr. Edwards. The Duesenberg isn't just valuable because it's rare. It has historical significance beyond its collector value." He paused, his gaze meeting Roy's directly. "It once belonged to a prominent political figure who used it during a critical period in American history. Documents were supposedly hidden in that car during a scandal. Documents that never..." Roy stared at him, understanding dawning, a cold wave washing over him. "Someone thought those documents might still be in the engine compartment. That's why they wanted me to stop working on it." "It's a theory," Peton acknowledged, a shadow of skepticism in his voice. "Though, after all these years, the likelihood of finding anything seems remote. Did you know about this when you brought me the car?" "I knew the rumors. Every serious collector does." Peton's tone was firm, brooking no doubt. "But I brought you the car because it needed fixing, not because of some wild treasure hunt." His gaze shifted, returning to the matter at hand. "Now, about my proposition." Before he could continue, the study door opened, and a middle-aged woman entered without knocking. It took Roy a moment to recognize her as Amanda Peton, Walter's daughter. Her resemblance to Lucille was striking, though her expression held none in the height of her mother's warmth. Instead, there was an air of thinly veiled impatience. "Sorry to interrupt, Father, but I need to speak with you." Her eyes flicked dismissively over Roy, dismissing him as inconsequential. Privately, "Amanda, this is Mr. Edwards, the mechanic who repaired the Duesenberg," Peton said, a hint of reproach in his voice, his posture stiffening. "Mr. Edwards, my daughter Amanda." She acknowledged Roy with a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "How nice." "Now, Father, whatever it is can wait," Peton said firmly, his voice cutting her off. "Mr. Edwards and I are discussing business." Amanda's lips thinned with displeasure, but she withdrew without further argument, the door clicking shut behind her. The brief, sharp interaction offered Roy a glimpse into family dynamics he hadn't considered and potential complications for Peton's proposed business venture. "You must excuse my daughter," Peton said, a strained politeness in his tone after she'd gone. "She's concerned about some of my recent financial decisions." "Mr. Peton," Roy began carefully, choosing his words. "If your family has reservations about this restoration facility—" "My family trusts my judgment," Peton interrupted, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "At least my wife does. Amanda worries that I'm being too generous with my resources. As I get older," he smiled slightly, a wry twist of his lips, "she fails to understand that what looks like generosity is often good business sense." Peton rose and moved to a drafting table in the corner of the study. He unrolled a set of elaborate blueprints, their crisp lines and detailed diagrams filling the space. Architectural plans. "I've had these drawn up for some time, waiting for the right opportunity. A purpose-built facility for the restoration and maintenance of classic automobiles." He gestured to the detailed drawings, which depicted a sprawling, state-of-the-art complex. 4 service bays, a machine shop, a paint booth, storage for parts, and completed vehicles. Everything needed to maintain not just my collection, but to service other collectors' vehicles as well. Roy examined the plans with growing amazement. This wasn't just a personal project. It was a fully conceived, meticulously planned business. "You've been planning this for a while," he observed, impressed. "For years," Peton confirmed, his gaze fixed on the blueprints. "But I needed the right person to run it, someone with the right combination of skills and integrity." "And you think that's me, based on fixing one car?" Roy asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Based on how you fixed it," Peton corrected, his eyes sharp. "You didn't just throw parts at the problem or rely on computer diagnostics. You thought it through. Used both scientific methods and intuition. That's rare these days." He rolled up the plans, securing them with a leather strap. "I'm offering you the chance to run this facility. Salary, benefits, and a 20% ownership stake." The figures Peton outlined next made Roy's head swim. It was more money than he'd ever imagined earning, more security than he dared hope for after years of struggling, a lifeline to a future free of debt and worry. "What about Calvin?" Roy asked when he finally found his voice, his thoughts instantly turning to his old friend. "And Fletcher's auto repair?" "As I said yesterday, that's between you and Mr. Fletcher, though I understand Auto Prime is making a strong play for his property." "They are," Roy confirmed, the unwelcome reality still a bitter taste in his mouth. "And now the town council is talking about eminent domain if he doesn't sell." Peton's expression hardened, a glint of steel in his eyes. "Politicians, always ready to sacrifice the individual for what they call progress." He considered for a moment, then a shrewd look entered his gaze. "Perhaps there's a solution that benefits everyone. The restoration facility will need an experienced business manager. The implication was clear, a generous extension of the opportunity. And Roy felt a surge of unexpected gratitude. Peton wasn't just offering him a way out.